folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. I hope you enjoyed your weekend, and we are in the second part of our Germans at War week. We are tackling four sort of distinct subjects this week, but we're starting with quite a heavy one, but it's good to tackle some of these subjects. And I was just saying to my guest before we started the stream is I can't believe it's taken so long to get him on, because when I compiled the list 2.5 years ago of people I wanted to have on the channel, his name was right on that first incarnation of the list. So Jeff Rutherford has written a couple of books, edited a couple of books, worked alongside some other well-known historians of the German side of things in World War II. He teaches history in Cincinnati in the States, and I'm delighted to bring him in. So just before I bring him in, just to say, if you are new to the channel, I always say this, just skip over this bit if you're bored with it, but please don't forget to like the channel, consider becoming a patron, subscribe, make sure you click the little bell to receive the notifications, and share what we're doing with your friends, because I think the guests we are bringing on are deserving of a bigger audience. So today we're looking at some German policy on the Eastern Front, and my guest is Jeff Rutherford. So I'll bring him in now. So good afternoon, Jeff. How are you today?
I'm doing quite well. Thanks for having me.
Good. So as I said in the top of the show there, you've kind of specialized in the German side of things, and with the German side of things, the Eastern Front. So tell me, how does a professor of history kind of develop that interest in that side of things? Was it always the Axis side of things? Was it something developed over the years? Was it from teaching? Was it from your your interest outside of teaching? Give me an idea where it all comes from.
Sure. It originally starts with the old World at War series that the BBC had. My father brought it home on VHS tape and was watching it, and I sat down and watched some of it with him, and just the scale of the war just captured my imagination right away. And it was something that I was interested in all throughout junior high school. And when I got to university, my first historian I worked with George Stein, who wrote the first real comprehensive history of the Waffen-SS. And he kind of steered me away from the, instead of just looking at the military stuff, let's look at the war as a whole, what the Germans are trying to accomplish. And that's kind of where it started there. And I was lucky enough when I went to write my dissertation at the University of Texas, my advisor, David Crew, was willing to have me explore these issues. So that's kind of where it started. And I've been working on the German army and the war that it waged, both militarily and ideologically, ever since.
And is the German side the aspect of World War II that is going through the most changes, in that there's the different sort of periods of assessing it in different ways? There's been a recent debate on Twitter the last year or so whether the teaching about the Holocaust should be part of the studies of military history or should it be separate. And then there was that kind of the era when people were kind of talking about how efficient the Germans were and their tanks are great and their aircraft are good. Then it kind of goes to the phase of no, but they were murdering their way across Europe. And has it seen lots of changes? And do you think it is the area that has seen the most changes over the decades?
I think certainly in the popular viewpoint, it's had the most changes. When I first started working on this, the books that I read talked purely about the military stuff, which is interesting, without a doubt, but it leaves out why the war was actually fought. And it does seem to me that, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the presentation, right? But we start to see in the late 70s, early 80s that German scholars in particular are looking at these issues. And I think it's the 90s that this kind of burst into popular view in Germany. And now it's become part of the discussion, I think, in the English-speaking worlds, that the German army is both a military organization that wages war on the battlefield, and it's also an organization that carries out numerous crimes in the name of the Third Reich.
And that's where you are in line with some of the other guests I've had over the last year or so, and David Harrisfield and people like that, you can't look at one without the other. You can't talk about German tanks without looking at what the crews are doing who are driving those tanks. You can't look at Operation Barbarossa without, as we'll discuss tonight, looking at what they're doing behind that and ahead of it, on the side of it. It's you tackle the whole subject or you don't tackle it at all. So you've come on with a PowerPoint presentation, and what we'll do, folks, is we'll kind of do little questions if they come up about things on the slide as they go along. Then you've got any kind of big questions for Jeff about kind of broad themes about German policy or large, and we'll do those at the end there. I remind you, of course, the links to a couple of Jeff's books in the description below. There's links to other of the resources you'll need here to get the best out of this. And I might put some links to some of the previous shows that connect with this once I know what it is Jeff is talking about, because I haven't heard this presentation myself, so it'll be really good. So I'm going to hand it over to you and say, folks, we'll put questions up on screen as they come through. But basically, we'll look at the German army and the occupation of the Soviet Union. So over to you, Jeff.
All right. Thanks, Paul. So when the Soviet-German war is generally discussed, it almost always focuses on the unprecedented clash of forces along the front. And we see the markers of Moscow and Stalingrad, Kursk, maybe Bagration, and Berlin kind of marking the way. And the reasons for this, I think, are pretty straightforward. First, one could make a strong case that the Red Army's defeat of Nazi Germany, or of the Nazi army, played the largest role in the defeat of the Third Reich. And I know that's a controversial take. I'm not going to discuss it anymore here, but it's a possible area for debate. I think secondly, more importantly for what I'm going to be talking about today, is that the struggle on the Eastern Front was initially written from the operational perspective of Hitler's field marshals and generals, right? That they won the immediate post-war the post-war battle for understanding what happened during the war. So their memoirs flooded the market, setting the parameters for our understanding of the war in the East, one that focused nearly exclusively on operational matters. So, right, we have Manstein's Lost Victories, Guderian's Panzer Leaders, Panzer Battles by von Mellenthin, right? There's numerous other books that all kind of fit into this idea. As the Cold War intensified, we also get a real effort by the West, particularly the United States, to learn the quote-unquote lessons that the Germans could provide the West in their dealings with the Soviets. So the United States Army Historical Division employed numerous German officers under the control of the former chief of the German General Staff, Franz Halder, and they were able to shape the war by their numerous writings. So Fighting in Hell, right, a collection of some of these shorter vignettes written by German officers. So I think this is one of the reasons why the focus on the war has been operational. I think there's another reason too, and that is the immense number of records captured after the war. How are people supposed to deal with this, right? How do you get into it and start to use these records to understand a war? And the war in the East is one that's in the shadows, right? In large part because the Soviets don't want their records getting out. The German generals have kind of formed the parameters. So when Western researchers start researching these captured German files, they start at the top, which makes sense, right? You get the big picture to understand what's going on. So we have some very good books that peel back the shadows of the war, but they generally limit themselves to the operational level of war. They're looking at army groups and fronts, at armies and corps. And the records that they're using are from the German perspective at least, are the IA or the operations officers, right? So this allows them to shape what happened on the battlefield. And this is all important, but if you focus on the war on the battlefield, you kind of ignore the reason for the war, right? And the reason that the Germans fight this war is to create this racial empire in the East. So this Vernichtungskrieg, this war of annihilation that happens in the rear, right? It's going on simultaneous to this massive clash of tanks and infantry and artillery at the front. But it's this war in the rear that really differentiates the German war in the East from other wars that they waged during the Second World War. So as I said, the goal for the Germans was the creation of this racial empire, one in which the Jewish population of the Soviet Union would be eradicated. This was done for both racial and political reasons, as the Germans believed that Jews were behind Bolshevism. So this is the proverbial killing of two birds with one stone if you eradicate or exterminate the Jewish population. This racial empire was built on the idea of German mastery, that Germans were superior and they would serve as a ruling class in the East, while the decimated Slavic peoples who remained would serve as essentially a slave class for their German masters. So the Germans would use the Soviets to exploit the abundant agricultural and natural resources of Soviet territory for Germany. And of course, German terror would keep the civilian population in line. So We get a few of these works early on. Alexander Dowlin's book that I have up there is one of the first ones that looks at this. But as we get into the late 70s, early 80s, we see that historians start to detail these policies in the rear. Now, much of this, again, is going to fall on the upper echelons of the German army to see how they are dealing with the upper echelons of the Nazi regime. We also have a lot of work on the SS and other German institutions, right, to kind of detail the war of annihilation waged by the Germans in the rear. Recent work, however, has focused on the lower levels. What we're looking at here are the identification of soldiers with Nazi ideology, right? How do they think about it? How did this influence their behavior on a day-to-day basis? As well as what this leads to in occupation policy, right? What is the reality of war at the local level? What's happening at the local level? And this is where I've done my work, and what I want to do today is examine how German divisions, and the divisions are the lowest level at which we have a lot of available documentation remaining. How do these divisions carry out their occupation policies? And the one thing that I do a little bit differently than what we've seen before is, and certainly I'm not the first person to do this, but this is what I try to focus on in my research, is certainly the IA documents, the operational documents, they have elements of what German occupation policy is, right? You can tease it out, and every now and then there'll be an order that makes it very clear. But you really have to get into the intelligence officers' documentation, and most importantly, the quartermasters, right? It's the quartermasters' documentation that tells us what German goals are and how they are trying to achieve them. So these are the ones that I've really focused on for this presentation.
And just to interrupt for a second, Jeff, sure. Because I started my career as a battlefield guide in the shadow of lots of the kind of the Sandhurst tour guides and the staff rides of the 60s and 70s. And the Guderian type books and Hans von Lück and those ones, they had huge reach, didn't they? I mean, they were popular reads. But if you go back a slide to that, I can't see some of those early sort of reaching the same kind, those books reaching that same platform because some of those surviving tank officers became almost some celebrities in the 60s and 70s. Hans von Lück, I'm thinking about particularly, and okay, he wasn't involved in the same level. He's a lower level regimental commander, but these guys, they were everywhere for sort of 20 years or so, and I think we're still in Britain dealing with a lot of that legacy of just how influential those operational studies were to an entire generation or two of staff officers in the British Army, and all the people who went on their tours, and all the people that read the books they wrote. And I think we're still coming out of that. And I know as an American, slightly different way of getting them because of the West Point, the staff colleges there were slightly different. But do you think that's something you see as an American, that the Britain has still got a bit of a kind of stuck in that rut of the 50s, 60s over kind of celebrity status of some of these German leaders and commanders?
Oh, I don't think it's just a British thing. I took my daughter to the local bookstore. I'm in Wheeling, West Virginia, which is not a cosmopolitan mecca of any sort. And Guderian's book is on the shelf. Monsnig's book is on the shelf, right? So these things sell. They tell an easily digestible story about the war, one that stresses heroism and, working against the odds and being frustrated by nebulous forces like the weather and the faceless Soviet mass and Hitler, right? That he's the ultimate boogeyman in these stories. So I think that this idea is still one that holds in much of the English-speaking world. And I think you're right that much of the scholarship that has been devoted to this has not reached the masses, and it's not become popular understanding of the war.
Yeah,
I would agree with that.
And there's a danger. We'll let you go back to your presentation. Is that danger again of the separation between Holocaust studies and military studies? And I'm absolutely in the you tackle them together or you don't do it at all. And I said that at the beginning of the show there. But there's that fear that it gets pushed aside again, and we still go back into examining the fronts and how the actual the campaigns were waged, and we just lose sight of the horror behind it. But I'll hand it back to you.
No, I'm in complete agreement that these things are one and the same, right? That the war against the Soviet Union is where the Holocaust starts, that you cannot separate these things. And the way the Holocaust develops is in large part because of the way the war develops, right? That these are part of the same thing, this is the war that Germany is waging. I completely agree.
Good. Right.
All right. So, Quartermaster's files. All right. So, if we think about what serves as the basis of the German army's occupation policy, I think we have three basic ideas that kind of merge with one another, interact with one another in different ways at different times. So, ideology, security, and economics, right? That at any given point, one of these will be more important than the other. But they're all kind of merged together. They're all kind of working together to create or formulate German policy on the ground. The other thing that we have to say is that these three ideas all operate within the general military situation. So, right, this is what we were just talking about, right? You can't separate what goes on in the rear from what goes on the front, right? That these are two, they're the same thing. It's a symbiotic whole. For the German divisional commanders on the ground, what happens on the battlefield helps them determine policy in the rear, right? That the army understands battlefield events, and this is what shapes their occupation policy in the rear, right? So these are part of the same thing. They can't be separated. So yeah, you read a book by Monstein or Guderian, you're getting a very small part of the story. And I also think that if you're just writing about what's going on in the rear and you make no mention of what's going on at the front, you're also missing part of the story, right?
Yeah.
That these things have to be discussed together in some way. So let's start in 1941. We'll spend a little bit of time on 1941 because I think this sets the tone for the entirety of the war, even as we see priorities shift here and there as the war develops. So the Army planned on defending the Soviet Union in a Blitz campaign, one that would last some 2 to 3 months. And since combat would be for such a brief period of time, the Army makes very little preparations, very few preparations for occupation. The idea was that they would simply turn over the areas to civilian administrators once the fighting had ended. So there's very little planning for the Army as it goes into occupying the Soviet Union. Now, there are some changes in how the Army is going to approach the Soviet Union as opposed to previous campaigns. The first has to deal with executive control. In previous campaigns, the Army jealously guarded its executive control in theaters of war. In other words, they wanted to be the only body that made decisions for what goes on in the rear area as long as the campaign was going. Well, we have a change here in the rear area as they get ready to invade the Soviet Union. And this had the first example of this is the Army agreement with the Einsatzgruppen in April 1941. So I'm sure everyone knows what the Einsatzgruppen are, but just briefly, these are essentially SS death squads that follow the German army into the Soviet Union. So the Army sacrifices this control for a combination of ideological and security reasoning. What we see is that these SS murder squads were tasked with special political tasks in the rear, and the Army was to provide them with support needed for them to carry out their tasks. So what were these tasks? The first is to eliminate resistance. And who the Einsatzgruppen are targeting here are primarily communist functionaries and male Jews. Jews were seen as kind of the physical embodiment of communism and thus the motor of all resistance in the Soviet Union. So the Einsatzgruppen, when they follow the German army into the Soviet Union, they are tasked with eliminating these groups. The Army accepts this. The Army provides them with the necessary logistics that they need to carry out their mission. Why does the Army do this? Well, because the Army's planning on this Blitz campaign, right? Their panzer groups are going to drive as quickly as possible deep into the Soviet rear. They're not going to control these areas that they drive through. They're just going to pass through them. So this becomes a question of who's controlling these areas? Are they pacified or are they not? The Germans realize the Soviet Union is huge. They realize that the security units they have that are going to be used to help pacify the area aren't big enough. The Army accepts the help of the SS. So already, even before the campaign starts, we see that the Army is giving up control and it's going to support the SS in what becomes a genocidal campaign. We see this combination of ideology and security also animating what served as the criminal orders, as they are popularly known. So the criminal orders consist of two. The first is a Commissar order, which demanded the immediate separation of all Soviet political officers from other prisoners and then their execution. It was almost a matter of faith throughout the German army that commissars were exclusively Jewish, and that their, and this is from a divisional document, barbaric Asiatic combat methods would terrorize Red Army men into staying in the field. According to one soldier, commissars, quote, form the unforgiving, hateful soul of the resistance, end quote. Wow. So the idea here is if we eliminate these individuals, the cohesion of the Red Army is destroyed. This makes German victory much easier. Second order was the Barbarossa Decree, or the curtailment of military jurisdiction. This had two parts. First part, the army takes away the power of army court-martials when dealing with any sort of popular resistance, and instead place the decision for life or death within the hands of officers within a German unit. So in other words, we get executions without legal proceedings, and this is just given entirely to the officer on the spot. When no perpetrators could be found, let's say a German unit's passing through a village, they take a couple pot shots, they don't see who did it, they're entitled to, or they're ordered to carry out collective measures, right? Punish the group. And this punishment could be whatever the individual officer decided. Arrest all the men, burn down the village, shoot everyone, right? It's all up to the officer himself. On the other hand, the directive also provided what amounted to a collective amnesty for German soldiers before the war began. If there was some sort of crime committed against Soviet civilians, court-martials were dispensed with, and it was left up to the individual officer to decide how to punish the German soldier. So, are German officers going to be punishing lots of their soldiers as they need to push across the Soviet Union in this brief period of time? Right? I mean, this sets it up for some sort of violent actions by German soldiers. So what we can say, I think, is that we have a German army that, as it invades the Soviet Union, it's fearful of a mindless population that is incited by various representatives of the so-called Judeo-Bolshevik regime, right, as the Nazis believed. So the army empowered its officers and enlisted men to crush whatever forms of resistance that emerged in hopes of achieving victory as soon as possible. We see this convergence of security and ideological thinking in the guidelines for the conduct of the troops in Russia. This directive opened with the claim that, quote, Bolshevism is the mortal enemy of the National Socialist German people, end quote. And then it argued that only ruthless and energetic action against Bolshevik agitators, saboteurs, and Jews, and the complete elimination of all active or passive resistance would allow the Germans to achieve victory. So I think this is an interesting kind of document here, right? In other words, the German leadership is essentially saying that Jews and Bolsheviks and anyone who resist, well, they're all one and the same, and they all have to be neutralized for Germany to achieve victory.
I'm guessing, Jeff, this is all tied up with the instilling the terror and the fear at the beginning, because we had a question from Ian Carr about the approximate number of personnel in the SS, or particularly, I guess, the Einsatzgruppen. So, as I think it was said, it's not that there's many of them. There's enough to do the job, but they've got to go in there and be firm right at the beginning and instill that terror so that they can achieve with limited numbers by fear. And I guess that's set up right in the planning.
Yeah, I mean, the SS Einsatzgruppen at the beginning of the campaign number around 2,000. Right. It is a small number. Now, they'll later be augmented by larger numbers of reserve police battalions, right? Christopher Bownings wrote about ordinary men, right? That type of thing. We'll have other Waffen-SS, SS cavalry units that are also used in the rear. German security divisions will get caught up in this, and they find themselves carrying out similar policies to the Einsatzgruppen at times. Yeah, it's not a large number. But the idea for the Germans is if we're targeted in who we take out, right? If we're targeted on communist functionaries and this belief that Jews are behind communism, if we're targeted on male Jews, then hopefully this will lead to the Soviet Union crumbling and we'll be able to achieve victory quickly. Yeah. So if we look at these orders, I think we get an atmosphere in which German soldiers are primed to both expect resistance, right, from communists, from Jews, and they're instructed on who needs to be neutralized, communists and Jews, in order to ensure that the military invasion is successful. So I think we can say that ideology and security overlap in 41 and play important roles in determining Army occupation policy.
Yeah.
Economics, though. Economics, I think, are vital to understanding German policy and the German Army's policy in 1941. So one of the primary reasons why Germany invades the Soviet Union is for food. It needs grain from Ukraine, right? The Nazi leadership thinks back to the First World War. We have this revolt in Germany because the German people are literally starving. So how are we going to make sure the German home front stays in the war? Keep them full. We get the grain from Ukraine. We can feed the German people. Then we can wage this longer war against the Anglo-Saxon sea powers if need be. So this desire to secure Soviet grain led to the development of the starvation plan. What this plan essentially said was that residents of urban areas in northern and central Russia, areas that were in the so-called deficit area, they would starve. They had primarily been fed from the surplus area, or Ukraine, right? So Ukrainian food surplus would be sent north to feed the large Soviet cities. What the Germans are going to do is take that surplus and divert it back to Germany to feed Germans. Soviet food would also feed German troops. The policy of living off the land was developed so that Germany wouldn't have to feed the 3 million German soldiers that invaded the Soviet Union at the expense of people at home. So German troops were instructed to supplement their rations for the invasion by scouring the countryside. Find your vegetables, find your potatoes, find your dairy products, cows, pigs, chickens, right? All of these are fair game for the Germans. Now, this in itself isn't brand new. What I found is looking at these divisions as they go through the war, they do this in every campaign. They live off the land in Poland, they live off the land in France, in Yugoslavia. In those cases, it's not ordered, right? They just do it because supply breaks down. The difference in the Soviet Union is that this is a plan from the get-go, right? That German soldiers are going to live off the land. So how do all these policies interact at the local level in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa? Well, I think we need to establish some context here for the campaign. So as I mentioned before, right, the Army has no coherent policy. There's very few preparations for an occupation. What we see instead is kind of an ad hoc, adjusted on the fly policy. Because of this, what matters is, we see it's a very individualized policy, right? That what matters most to individual commanders on the ground, divisional commanders, is how do you safeguard your troops? How do you ensure that they maintain their combat effectiveness as they work towards final victory? So how this would be accomplished depends on a variety of factors, right? It's commander's personality. It's that unit's position in the war on any given day. It's their experiences that they've had prior to that day. So this is a very fluid thing. Certainly, the Army High Command, Army groups, they send down orders about how occupation should be carried out. But there's no unanimity across the front, right? It's very different for different divisions. Even ones that are operating within the same corps or same army, we see that they have different emphases in what kind of policies they're setting out. Second major contextual issue, Nazi racial ideology is important, right? Certainly not every German who invades the Soviet Union in 1941 is a raging Nazi fanatic, right? Not everyone is a racial warrior, but these guys have been receiving a lot of indoctrination, especially in the lead up to 1941. The German army makes a real effort to move more and more Nazi ideology into the instruction, the political instruction that they get. And many German soldiers certainly have notions of cultural superiority over the East, and that these traditional notions of German superiority are only reinforced by Nazi ideology. So many German soldiers, as they cross over into the Soviet Union, they view it as a primitive, dirty cultural wasteland. This is a theme that just emerges time and again as you read letters that they write home. Just they're shocked at what they see when they get into the Soviet Union.
I mean, and David Harrisfield said that when he was on the show, that that's borne out in the letters, is that they truly believe when they write to their parents that they are doing the right thing and they're part of a purification, and they're almost enjoying doing it. And it's difficult for us 80 years on to consider that human beings would be in these cases, going through these actions, kind of not feeling any moral quandary about it. They're doing it openly and honestly and believing they do the right thing. But it was part of this ideology that fueled it. And Dr. Phil Blood is watching tonight, who would back us up on saying this is, as you said, it's not everybody, but it's enough of an overwhelming feeling behind this army to be the norm.
Right. And the general ideology just creates this context where you can do what you want because there is really no value placed on those that you're fighting against. I will say I've come across letters of soldiers who found Soviet civilians. There's a little bit of pity for them. They think that they're victims of this quote unquote Judeo-Bolshevik regime, but most seem to have believed that the Soviet people were inferior people who deserve to sit at the feet of the Germans. So I think ideology is very important. We don't want to underestimate that. The third thing I think we need to talk, or at least mention here, is that in 1941, ideology seems to me to be the most important of these three ideas floating around determining policy. But this changes. And I think when it becomes clear the Soviet Union isn't going to be defeated in one campaign, economic goals increase in importance. So these things are all, as I said, kind of linked together, but they change over time. So let's take a look at how this develops during the war. So as we can see on the map, right, and I'm sure we're all familiar, the Germans attacked with 3 army groups into the Soviet Union. One army group north heading towards Leningrad, army group center heading in the direction of Moscow, army group south heading in the direction of Ukraine. So the emphasis on security and ideology in 1941 led to murderous policies towards those groups the Germans believed threatened their victory. Jews, communist functionaries, including commissars, and alleged partisans. Now, if we start with the Jews, the army supported the Einsatzgruppen in their activities all across the front. This is very different than in Poland, where we see real clashes between the Army High Command and Army commanders in the field who are upset by what the Einsatzgruppen are doing. In the Soviet Union, we don't see that. We see a lot of cooperation. The army knows that if it runs into a trouble, it can call on the Einsatzgruppen to help come up with a solution. Of course, the solution tends to be mass murder, but that is where the army is.
Well, when you say support, you don't just mean kind of endorsement. You mean actual physical, practical support with trucks and transport and ammunition and the paraphernalia that will go along with what these groups need to do their function.
Yes, exactly. That they provide them a logistical support. I mean, the largest massacre of 1941 at Babi Yar, this is one in which German 6th Army is intimately involved. Right, that von Reichenau is helping to shepherd this process along, and it's clear that not only does the German army support Einsatzgruppen units in the field, but we have elements of the German army that carry out their own so-called Jew hunts. Right, that Waitman Born has written about this. Right, that army units are involved with this. We have security divisions from the get-go that are involved in mass murder of Jews. So this is something that we see from the get-go. And even when Einsatzgruppen policy shifts in late summer, early fall of 1941, and every Soviet Jew is now targeted with murder, there's no resistance from the army. There's no murmurs of what are we doing, right? That they go along with this. So for the army, murdering of Jews, Soviet Jews, is not a problem. Commissars were also targeted, despite what the Mansteins and Guderians write in their post-war books. This order was passed on, and recent research has indicated that nearly every German division deployed to the east murdered commissars in 1941. So in both these cases, we can say the army is targeting relatively small numbers of individuals, though we can say once the Einsatzgruppen breaks off and starts to murder all Soviet Jews, that this number increases exponentially. But there are targets here that the Germans are focusing on. Now, the army policies that proved much more destructive to the mass of the Soviet population were those that dealt with popular resistance, both real and imagined, and food confiscation. So in terms of the former, Soviet soldiers who escaped the mass encirclement battles of 1941 constituted the real security issue for the Germans. But these were conflated into a larger partisan movement, one that the criminal orders primed the Germans to expect. So the German response to any manifestation of popular resistance was sharp, burning down villages, taking hostages, executing everyone in the village, And this happens from the start of 1941, right from the beginning of the invasion. But it radicalizes in fall 1941. So, for example, Army Group North, there are 3 security divisions operating in the rear there. During the first 3 months of war, these 3 security divisions together had executed around 2,000 Soviet civilians and Red Army men who had been roaming the countryside. In October, the 3 divisions execute 6,000, right? 1 month. So we see this major explosion here in terms of severity of violence. And we see similar increases all across the breadth of the front. So why? What happens? I think it's a military situation. October 2nd, Operation Typhoon, right? The last desperate assault on Moscow is launched. The Germans believe that if they are going to be able to win this war in 1941, they're going to have to pacify the rear, and this could only be done through concentrated and sustained violence, right? A massive bloodletting. This is the way to pacification. So do we have a partisan movement in 1941? Yes, it is small. It's embryonic. It's decentralized. The scale and severity of the German response caught up tens of thousands of civilians who were literally in the wrong place at the wrong time. So this is one policy that really hits Soviet people hard. The next one that does is economics, right? This policy of living off the land proves most detrimental to Soviet civilians. So despite numerous orders from all levels of command that instructed the troops to stop individual requisitioning, in plain English, stop plundering people, stop stealing their food, it's clear that this practice continued throughout 1941. As an institution, the Army wanted an orderly exploitation of the Soviet Union's resources. As one divisional commander noted in an order to his troops, quote, "We want to always keep in mind, England wants to starve Germany. Russia has the means Germany needs." Right? So there is this idea within the German army, even at divisional level command, that this is a war for resources. The idea here was that the army was going to work with another institution called Economic Staff East to exploit the Soviet Union's resources in an orderly manner. As a representative of Economic Staff East remarked in late fall 1941, however, the largest obstacle to an orderly exploitation of the Soviet Union's resources was the German army itself. Individual soldiers simply took what they wanted when they wanted, even if it meant there would be no livestock or crops for the coming year. One German soldier remarked that he and a small group of his men, they went into a village and one of his guys killed the last cow because he wanted fresh liver. And then he left the cow there to rot, right? So now we have a village that has nothing, right, to go forward. And as this German soldier remarked, they've only created more people to fight, right? More partisans to resist the Germans. So this living off the land leads to widespread misery, hunger, and starvation across the occupied territories. The most prominent example of this, obviously, is Leningrad. And we can look at this in 2 ways. On the one hand, in the siege line around Leningrad, the army sucks the surrounding area dry. So starvation, disease, cannibalism, right? This is all over the Leningrad siege line. And of course, Leningrad itself, right? The Germans hope to bring it to its knees through starvation. And current estimates are around 2 million Soviet civilians starved in the city during the war. In this respect, I'd also like to mention the fate of Soviet POWs. This isn't necessarily a question of occupation, but I think it clearly ties into German economic goals during the campaign. Of the 3.3 million Red Army men the Germans capture by the end of 1941, 2.2 million of them are dead by February 42. Mass shootings, lack of medical care for wounded, but starvation. This is the main issue here. And I think the desire to feed Germans instead of Soviets played the primary role. So once again, ideological and economic concerns reinforce one another.
There's a couple of questions for you now that have come in.
Sure.
People are, I'll put Ian's question up. Did the Germans review their policies when they were being welcomed by some people? So the Ukraine, for example, they were in some ways kind of welcomed as liberating them from the Soviet oppression. So did that affect policy, or did it affect the reaction of German soldiers on the ground? So that's the first question, and I'll let you deal with that. Another one coming up in a minute.
Okay. Yeah, no, when the Germans go into the Baltic states, when they go into Ukraine, lots of letters, lots of diaries talk about how they're being welcomed as liberators. Certainly, there are some German officers who recognize that we could do something with this. But for the men on the ground, right, when you're hungry, you're hungry. And if you have the ability to go take a chicken or a pig and bring it with you on your trip, you're going to do that because you've been empowered to do so. I think what we really have here is short-term thinking by the Army, short-term thinking, from the highest leadership all the way down to the lowest private, right? That we're going to win this war quickly. We're going to be out of here before this becomes a real problem. And of course, the Nazi leadership has zero intention of giving these groups any sort of independence. Many of the Ukrainian nationalist groups that work with the Germans, they find their leadership decimated by Nazi Germany, not too far into the invasion. So I think this is short-term thinking by the Germans. They recognize that they're seen as liberators by many Ukrainians and Baltic peoples. But as their own supply lines become problematic, you take what you can. And I think your ideology matters.
And I suppose in the previous campaigns, even in Western Europe, just because elements of a civilian population of a country you've just taken cheer you when you march down the street doesn't necessarily mean they actually support you. I guess the Germans are cynical enough to realize that they could just be, they're waving out of one window, making Molotov cocktails in the other room. It just because there's an apparent sense of gratitude doesn't mean that is something you're going to necessarily completely believe. I suppose they're cynical, and they've there's been other campaigns they fought where the population is given an image that isn't necessarily what the entire population thinks. The other question was about from Goodman there about whether things are different for the other Axis troops that are moving into Barbarossa, because as we know, Hungarians, Italians, Romanians, Slovak, Finnish troops, are they generally broadly operating under the same kind of policies, or do they adapt things differently based on their own commanders and their own opinions on matters?
That's a great question. And I don't have a full answer for it, right? What I have is, what I've read with Grant Harward's book on Romania's Holy War. It does seem clear that many of the Axis units that accompany the Germans fight a similar type of war, particularly with partisans. It's also clear that Romania wages its own type of holy war against the Jewish population of Transnistria. But I can't speak with certainty on what they're doing. The Italians, we see similar types of things, but certainly not to the same level of severity. But I really can't speak with any authority on those questions.
And I guess they don't form, even combined, they still only form a relatively small percentage of the forces moving in Barbarossa. So
in 1941, for sure, yeah.
So
much smaller forces.
Even if they're acting differently, it's against the trend of the main force.
Correct.
Right, I'll hand it. That's enough. We'll do some more questions later on, folks. I'll hand it back to Jeff.
Okay. So if we evaluate German occupation policies in 41, we can say that security and ideological goals ensured that those who believed to threaten battlefield victory, communists and Jews, were mercilessly targeted. But a far larger number were caught up in German policies that attempted to strangle any popular resistance and strip local inhabitants of food. And this is where that short-term thinking, I think, comes in. Because the Germans thought they were going to win so quickly, no efforts were made to construct a durable occupation order. And even when it became clear towards the end of 41 that the war is going to last into 42, the Germans become much more concerned about their own combat effectiveness, and they don't care about civilians or their fate at all. It's only after the stabilization of the so-called winter crisis, so spring 1942, that we see a reevaluation of Soviet practices and goals. So we get this real evolution in 1942. Why? Well, big picture. Nazi Germany now has a much larger war in its hands, right? It's not only fighting the British Empire, it hasn't defeated the Soviet Union. It's going to have to fight a second campaign there. It's stuck deep in the Soviet Union. Now the United States is in the war. So it faces a much larger resource-rich coalition. Second part, right? It's stalled in the Soviet Union. Not only is it stalled, it's suffered real losses, both in terms of quantity and quality. And I think the quality matters, right? These battle-tested NCOs and officers, right? And this gets back to your discussion a couple of weeks ago about Auftragstaktik, right? That the loss of these individuals matters for how the Germans can fight the war. Because of this, because of these losses, Germany can only fight on one front. It's only going to be able to launch an offensive on one front as opposed to the three. So they're going to launch the campaign into the Caucasus and towards Stalingrad. Army Group North and Center are going to dig in. While they're digging in, we see that the Army starts to think about this war as one of resources, right? That we're going to have to exploit all the resources that we can under our control. Because the Army controls a large chunk of the Soviet Union, this becomes their primary goal in 1942. So, how does this modification of policy work? Well, we got a couple policies, a couple things that go into this. First, the Army wants to modify the attitudes of its men and therefore the behavior, right? We get numerous orders that cascade down the hierarchy in an attempt to convince the men that Soviet civilians were indeed human beings and needed to be treated as such. The best example of this came from the Army High Command in May 1942. It argued that, quote, mastery should never degenerate into contempt towards the defenseless vanquished. And it appealed to the troops to treat civilians, quote, strictly but fairly, as this would allow for, quote, a quick pacification of the country. It continued, it is wrong and detrimental to our own interests to see the native population as without rights and honor as account of their outward proletarian appearance, because as experience shows, this is only camouflage against Bolshevik terror. The German soldier protects the property of the laboring and peaceful population. He respects the sense of honor of Russian women and girls. He supports the reconstructive work in the rear areas. He must know that the capricious acts create opposition, stir up embitterment, and therefore threaten the security of our troops. It goes without saying the Germans are doing all this stuff, right? And that's why the order has to be issued.
Yeah.
One division stated that, quote, the feeling of legal uncertainty, even lawlessness, end quote, that existed for Soviet civilians needed to disappear, that Soviets had to feel like they had rights under German occupation. Now, of course, the very fact that these orders have to be issued and then reissued again and again during 1942 indicate that they're not working as well as the Germans would hope, and that clearly the ideological foundations of the campaign had made their mark on the troops, and orders from above simply couldn't reverse this. The Army also instituted propaganda policies designed to win over the Soviet population, a nascent type of hearts and minds program, I think. The Germans came up with highly touted agrarian reforms that promised land to the Soviet population that had been forced onto these collective farms. They opened up churches to great acclaim. They put on public spectacles to celebrate the end of Bolshevism. So there's these two efforts here, right? Convince the troops to treat the Soviets like people, convince the Soviets people to support the German war effort. So this need for a more conciliatory policy was based on the need to feed or to fully exploit the Soviet economy. 1941's policy was living off the land, essentially individual soldiers stealing food for themselves. 1942's could be summed up by the following declaration by a divisional quartermaster in July 1942. This war is an economic war. It is for the existence and future of our people. The guarantee of food independence is of decisive importance for this war. It demands the organized exploitation of the entire economic area. The area conquered and occupied by the German Wehrmacht constitutes a section of this economic area. A German panzer division stated that the goal for the year of 1942 was to make the German Eastern Army autarkic, or self-sufficient in terms of food. So this is living off the land taken to an entirely new level. This is not just to feed Germans as well. As one corps explained, quote, it is of decisive importance for the continuation of the war in the East that everything be done to secure the sustenance of the troops, makes sense, and the civilian population from the countryside. Now, this shift in policy was not because the German army all of a sudden became humane and was worried about the fate of Soviet individuals as people. It's pragmatic. They need people to work. Yeah. Nonetheless, it's a shift. right? In 1941, civilians are left to starve. In 1942, the Germans are trying to give them enough food so they'll be productive workers for the German war effort. So in the static northern and center sections of the front, combat divisions became very interventionist in their area of deployment. So a panzer division, right? Those panzer divisions upon which the entire victory in the East depends. Well, one of them that was in Army Group North, they established an agronomy section to coordinate the harvests in its area. In a report on its success in this area, the quartermaster termed the scrounging up of seeds for next year's planting, quote, a considerable achievement. So in 1941, a considerable achievement for this panzer division was to drive to the gates of Leningrad. In 1942, its considerable achievement is to collect seeds from all over the rear area to ensure a harvest in 1943. This strikes me as remarkable, right? That the Germans don't have a lot of panzer divisions. They know this is the only way they can win the war. And here they have one which has been relegated to the status of an agricultural overseer. And I think this highlights the importance of economics in determining German occupation policy in 42. Agricultural concerns were not.
You can't separate the military operational level from this economic level, because the two are one and the same. And again, if we have one of those kind of YouTube videos playing of where the front line is moving, as you said there in 42, that the northern and central bit wouldn't be moving very much because it would be dug in. So it would be saying, well, everything's happening down around Stalingrad. But now you're saying that there's this kind of war to feed people that's happening that isn't being replicated by the movement of arrows, but it is still an integral part of German military policy in the East.
For sure, right? That in the northern and center parts of the front, these units are holding on, right? They're holding line. The Soviets launch all sorts of attacks. They hold the line, but in the rear area, you look at their files and there's two different wars going on, right? They're fighting the Red Army at the front and they're fighting the agricultural war in the rear. And for a panzer division to be talking about this, it's quite interesting, I think.
It really is. People are remarking. In the last few minutes, people said this is amazing stuff. I didn't know this. So thank you for bringing something to us that is people going, oh wow, that's great. There are other channels just constantly debating whether the Tiger tank is better than Sherman, and I like it that we're bringing people ideas and cause them to go, oh, I didn't know that. That's exactly what we're trying to do here.
Well, that's good. Glad we can do that. All right, so agriculture is important. Labor is the other big thing for the Germans. 1942, Hitler sets up a Reich labor action. It's headed by Fritz Sauckel, one of his old buddies who's a Gauleiter in Germany. He's tasked with finding workers for Germany. Well, due to ideological reasons, right? Slavs are low on the Nazi racial scale, and due to the fact that there's no government the Germans have to negotiate with in the occupied Eastern territories, and they have 3 million armed men on the ground, it's this Soviet Union becomes the site of the highest numbers of workers shipped back to Germany. The divisions on the ground become very involved with this. One division announced that, quote, the very large demand for labor power in Germany requires a transfer of some 2 million people from the Russian expanse, while another corps argued that the great shortage of workers in Germany, especially in armaments industry and agriculture, demanded the increased use of prisoners of war. Well, as we've already talked about, prisoners of war have died in great numbers, so it's going to have to be Soviet civilians that fit into this. So one infantry division went so far as to create 2 special labor posts, right, with an officer in charge who figured out where the civilians in their area of operations were going to go. Were they going to work at the front, or were they going to be sent to the rear to work in Germany? So German combat divisions and rear area units, they helped round up civilians for work. A lot are sent to Germany, but a lot also stay at the front. We see that Germans utilize Soviet civilians to work at the front for a multitude of activities. Agricultural work, obviously, but we have those who work on road maintenance, which is an ongoing issue. They build rail lines, and we see a lot of fortification work. So at any given time, you could have upwards of 10,000 civilians laboring for a frontline combat division in Army Groups North or Center in 1942. So we can say in 1942, it looks like economic goals triumph over ideological ones. Now, this is not to say that communists and Jews were safe, right? If found, they were going to be arrested and or executed. Civilians still starved. though the intentionality and the scale from 1941 had certainly diminished, as long as one was deemed capable of labor. Those who were seen as incapable of labor, they had a much more arbitrary fate, I think. Of course, coercion and violence remained central to German policies in the East. And while we have these conciliatory policies designed to work to win over Soviets for the German war effort, we have vigorous security policies that frequently bled over into military operations that targeted civilians. So these have been described as anti-partisan operations or as Bandenbekämpfung, right, bandit fighting. The German army was determined to maintain a pacified rear area in order to ensure its frontline units weren't threatened from the rear, and in order to ensure this orderly exploitation of the rear area. Now, these security operations also contain an economic component. So if we look at one carried out by a Panzer division, it claimed the deaths of 211 partisans at the cost of 156 casualties for the division. So real fighting, right? A real operation. Just as importantly, the division noted that it seized 117 tons of rye, 50 tons of grain, and 60 cows. So economics play into these security operations. Another frontline combat infantry division carried out a cleansing action, as it was deemed, in which it confiscated 100 cattle and deported 800 civilians to the rear to be plugged into the German war economy. So during the course of 1942, German occupation policy underwent a noticeable evolution. Violence is still the foundation, all right, of the Army's interaction with civilians. But the realization that the war required the use of all available resources meant that the Army introduced more conciliatory occupation policies to win over Soviet civilians. This obviously is most apparent in agriculture. But there's contradictions here. And there's contradictions all throughout German occupation policy in the East. Germany needs workers. Well, it gets these workers by essentially kidnapping Soviets to send to Germany or forcing them to work at the front. Well, this is not going to increase their enthusiasm, right? And this is only going to lead to increased resistance on the part of people who want no part of this. Well, increased resistance leads to increased German reprisals, which turn more civilians against the German war effort. So the Germans have an idea of what they want to do, but in a sense, they can't get out of their own way, right? This belief of violence, this belief in security in the rear, this kind of almost sabotages their economic policies here at the front. So if 1942 showed a more nuanced approach by the Germans to occupation, 1943 saw a doubling down on both of the approaches that emerged in 42. So on the one hand, the importance of local resources was only magnified by the German catastrophe at Stalingrad. The initiative seemingly on the side of the Red Army, German field commands now needed to operate, as one division commander announced, quote, within the framework of total war. This meant that German divisions were going to become much more involved in the day-to-day lives of Soviet civilians living under their control. It also meant that the Germans would become much more systematically destructive when they perceived the general military situation demanded it. So we'll start with the second approach, that of systematic destruction. This was most clearly linked to the retreats that took place in late 42, but especially early 43 across the front. Now, in the South, right, following the Soviet attack on Stalingrad, Army groups A, B, Don, right, the retreats that they carry out are chaotic. These are not well organized or structured. But we do have a couple of retreats. The first one is in the Kuban, as 17th Army is trying to pull back after the attack on Stalingrad. And then on the map here, we can see the green pocket there in the middle, the Rzhev salient, and then just to its northwest, we have the Demyansk pocket. So what we see is that in all three cases, Kuban, Demyansk, Rzhev, the Germans evacuated an area that was either no longer tenable because of it had to escape destruction, like 17th Army in the South, or because of the appalling casualties in the southern section of the front, it made no sense to hold these positions, right? Shorten the line, let's retreat. So these retreats are all carried out for military reasons, right? Military reasons for the why. But the how of the retreat, I think, is determined by economics. So when the Germans retreat, in addition to the normal retreating, or the normal policies that retreating armies carry out: destruction of roads, bridges, railroads, shelters, right? Things to slow down the enemy army. The Germans engage in systematic efforts to strip these areas of anything of value. All movable agricultural goods, livestock, people were forced west behind German lines, while the Germans utterly destroyed the two regions. For example, in the retreat from the Rzhev salient, the city or the town of Vyazma was in this salient. And when the Germans left, there was only 51 buildings left standing, the original 5,500, right? So they move everything with them as they retreat and devastate the area as they leave. So ideology makes this acceptable, right? You can carry out this type of scorched earth retreat in the Soviet Union because of who you are fighting from the Nazi perspective. But economic concerns, exploiting Soviet resources for themselves, and by this stage in the war, ensuring the Soviets can't use them either, right? This becomes a fundamental aspect of German policy. So in areas where the Germans were threatened, they resorted to comprehensive scorched earth retreats. In areas where the lines held, we get a much more interventionist occupation policy. And this is best reflected in an order from 9th Army in early May. Opening with the line, quote, "Total war demands the total employment of all labor, power, and the complete registration and collection of all materials important for the war," end quote. He continued by stating that, quote, "Every prisoner of war and civilian capable of labor equals a worker. Every captured weapon, the savings of raw material and labor output." Essentially what the order was saying was that the Germans have to systematically yoke the Soviet economy to the German war economy, right? There can no longer be any sort of outside economic thinking or practices. It all has to be done for the German war effort. Not a single German weapon, not a single captured weapon was to rust in the rear. Not a single man or woman who could work was to remain outside of the German war economy. Frontline combat divisions became even more intimately involved with the populations in their areas of deployment. So we get labor roundups. One division ordered the registration of everyone born between 1923 and 1925 so that it could see who was in its area and who could be shipped off to work. Everybody for this 3-year period of births. Other divisions carefully vetted their population skills, looking for engineers or armament workers who could be more profitably used elsewhere. Agriculture, again, right, vital to the German war effort, operating under the belief that, as one division commander put it, quote, "The most far-reaching economic exploitation of the occupied territories is a task decisive for the war. Frontline divisions put their own men into the fields." One thing here, Paul. In the month of May, one division reported it had 3,800 soldiers and civilians working a total of 41,000 hours in the fields, right? That agriculture still remains vital to the German war effort here in 43.
I'm just going to jump in. I think most people watching this are very much aware of scorched earth, and we've all seen films like the Russian film Come and See and the burning of stuff. But I think in the understanding of that, we've lost sight of the fact of how much they're still using themselves. I think we perceive it as more random and vengeful, and we understand the denying it the enemy aspect. But I think we've completely lost but harnessing as much as they can from themselves. I think that's been lost. And I think what you're saying tonight is really, for most people watching, myself included, is really kind of reinventing the wheel somewhat. And yeah, brilliant stuff.
Yeah, no, you're right. When you read some of the letters and diaries that German soldiers write after they burned something down or destroyed it, yeah, that vengefulness comes through, right? That anger, that rage. But there is an economic basis to a lot of this. And when the Germans have time to carry out a phased retreat and they have time to plan it, they remove anything that can be moved that has economic value. So that they can continue to use it for the war effort while simultaneously denying it to the Soviets. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, amazing stuff.
So as this emphasis on an orderly and systematic exploitation of Soviet goods increased, so too did the need to safeguard this exploitation. Anti-partisan actions, now radicalized into bandit fighting, became much larger and more violent. We have large operations carried out in the rear, which include frontline units, but also SS, police units, auxiliary forces. And we have smaller ones at the front, carried out by frontline combat divisions. These demonstrate both the increasing threat posed by the partisan movement, as well as the effects, I should say, of increased ideological indoctrination. So the brutality of these operations is quite clear. One carried out by a Panzer Division, Operation Mai Gewitter, resulted in over 2,400 dead partisans at the cost of a handful of German casualties. Another one, Operation Weichsel, carried out by several SS units, as well as a security division. So here's the SS and the Army working together, resulted in over 400 German enemy dead at the cost of some 28 German casualties. So these are unequal fights. I think what's more interesting is the economic benefits from this. Operation Mai Gewitter led to the Germans confiscating nearly 300 cows and over 7 tons of grain, while Operation Weichsel gained some 21,000 livestock and nearly 19,000 forced laborers, right? So the economics tie into these security objectives of the army. Now, this completely flips at Kursk, right? The German defeat at Kursk signifies, well, the defeat of the German army at Kursk and then the subsequent Soviet offensives, right? The Red Army has the initiative for the remainder of the war. The German army is on the retreat. So we see that German occupation policy radicalizes from this point forward. And the idea of scorched earth retreat becomes the dominant way in which the army approaches the last year and a half of war in the Soviet Union. So as they carry out these scorched earth retreats, we'll just take a quick look at the version that takes place north of the Kursk Bulge after the defeat there in July 43. So German units carry out a retreat to the Hagen Line. Now, the Hagen Line was constructed by civilians who were forced to work for the Germans. And during the withdrawal to the Hagen Line, we see that economics, ideology, and security all come together once again. So we have this comprehensive scorched earth policy. Orders were issued to destroy machine tractor factories, state farms, some 40 industrial plants, and over 100 mills, dairies, and breweries. Some 11,000 hectares were burned, destroying an estimated 12,500 tons of hay. One division even demanded, quote, every soldier behind the main battle line must be assigned the task of uprooting 100 potato plants in the early hours of the morning, right? So this is scorched earth down to the lowest level. One divisional order I found said that all shrubs that could be used for cover by the Soviets had to be destroyed, right? So this is turning the area into a desert. This is what the German goal was. Economic goods that could be moved were, and this, of course, included people. During the retreat to the Hagen Line, some 58,000 tons of food, 60,000 tons of fodder, nearly 100,000 cattle, and some 23,000 horses were extracted from the region. Wow. The Germans hoped to move out somewhere between 350 to 400,000 people, hoping to get some 100,000 workers from them. In the event, within 2 weeks, they had 80,000 civilians working on the next line behind the Hagen Line, the Panther Line. Security practice also radicalized. Soviet success at the front emboldened partisan activity in the rear. This led to larger and more violent German responses. Dead zones became German policy, right? Completely destroy an area so that it can't support any sort of partisan effort. So by late 1943, there's really little to differentiate the Army's struggle in the rear from its retreats. In both cases, the Army left behind a smoking wasteland, deprived of all shelter, factories, and other industrial and commercial installations. All livestock was either shipped west or slaughtered to rot in the fields, crops either loaded into German trains or burned in the fields, and all civilians capable of work deported to the west. Now, a practice that developed during the war before culminating in 1944 was for the Germans to simply leave behind the sick and the old for the oncoming Red Army to deal with. So we can imagine the fate of these individuals kind of abandoned to the no man's land between the retreating Germans and the advancing Soviets. So I think by late 43, early 44, we can say that German occupation policy in the East evolved to its final stage. The Vernichtungskrieg, that war of annihilation that began in 1941, targeting specific Soviet population groups, had thus expanded by 1944 to one that viewed the entire civilian population, infrastructure, and all foodstuffs and livestock as legitimate targets to be plundered and destroyed at will. So, how do we balance all of these ideas together? And this will wrap it up for us. First, I think it's impossible, as I said, to separate the three. They all work in conjunction with one another. Second, Nazi ideological beliefs are vital to this. They serve as the foundation, right? They legitimize mass violence and economic exploitation. The Germans want to economically exploit France and Belgium, and they do. And they have security issues in Western Europe. But the army policies fail to become as severe in Western Europe as they do in the Soviet Union, and this is because of ideology. Nazi racism made things possible in the Soviet Union, and they informed much of the murderous conduct of 1941, the most blatantly ideological campaign of the war. Third, despite this ideological foundation, army occupation policy did not follow a uniform path of radicalization. Instead, the military situation, the Army's appreciation of it, determined policy. So in 1942, we see a readjustment of the balance between the three factors. Believing that the war could still be won, but realizing that resource mobilization was now paramount, the German Army decided to place priority on economic considerations. The Army instituted policies and programs that opposed Nazi beliefs, right? Instead of treating Soviet civilians as subhumans, there were attempts to win them over to the German cause. Now, of course, German security concerns manifested themselves in generally arbitrary anti-insurgent operations, and the results of these, combined with the seizure of both workers and food, only led to increased resistance. So we get this cycle of violence. By 1943, the defeat at Stalingrad changed the calculus again. Economic thinking again gained prominence, but now the denial of resources to the Red Army was almost as important as the mobilization of Soviet resources for the German war effort. These scorched earth retreats in early 1943 became the models for later ones, demonstrating the lengths to which German units would go to in hopes of maintaining their battlefield effectiveness. At the same time, in those quiet sections of the front, the Army doubled down on its policy of economic mobilization, trying to turn the Soviet-occupied territories into a functioning part of the German war economy. As I said, the defeat at Kursk ended all hopes of German victory, and its occupation policy radicalized to one of utter destruction and exploitation. Winning hearts and minds was no longer an option. So in the final analysis, all of these things played a very important role: security, economics, ideology. But I think when we look at how the Vernichtungskrieg, this war of annihilation, expands in the Soviet rear, that it's economics that perhaps play the largest role in driving German policy here in the Soviet Union. That's what I got.
Well, you've won me over. I mean, you managed to convince me that economics, I think I'm speaking for the audience, is that I think we've always come to believe that a lot of this scorched earth policy is kind of collateral damage. It's not so much accidental, but it's not really connected with, certainly not with economic policy. If it's connected to anything, it's denying, as I said, resources to the enemy. But the fact it's part of this overriding behind the scenes needs to feed their own army, I think is the revelation today. So yeah, absolutely brilliant stuff, Jeff. I mean, and I'm now feeling even more stupid for not having you on earlier in the 2 years. But yeah, whatever. We'll invite you back to come on and expand on this. And economics aren't sexy. If you're interested in tanks and aircraft and World War II battles, economics doesn't seem to be as exciting as discussing frontal armor on tanks and that kind of thing. But what you're explaining is actually it's integral, and you cannot separate the ideology from the economics from the military side of it. And as we said at the beginning, you tackle it all or you don't tackle it at all.
Yeah, and I think this is what makes the war in the Soviet Union the war, right? And certainly, right, there are great arguments, right? O'Brien's How the War Was Won, talks about the Allies and the way that they win the war. And, there's all sorts of things that go into it. But I think what makes the Soviet-German war so unique is the military aspect, the economic aspect, the ideological aspect, right? That this is a war which combines it all, and that you have to look at all of it for it really to make sense. I mean, this is what the Second World War is fought for, right? It's fought for Germany to create that racial empire.
When people are saying, do we need any more books on the Nazis in World War II? And it depends what you're writing about. And no, I don't think we need any more photographic studies showing every single view of Panzer IVs knocked out in Kursk. I kind of think that's been done. But yes, there is definitely work to be done on connecting all these broader themes into one. And people like yourself and David Harrisford and Phil Blood, who's watching, amongst the people bringing that Adam Tooze, I guess, as well, from the economic side of things.
For sure.
That's where the work is being done. To connect all this, but at the same point, never forgetting the ideology, never forget the rampant evil that runs behind it, that hatred of perceived lesser peoples that drives the need for economy. So absolutely brilliant stuff. I'm gonna take you off screen for just a second, remind people what we're coming up this week, and I'll come back and bring you in a second. So, folks, I'm reeling from that. That was just amazing stuff. There's nothing tomorrow. On Wednesday, we have 2 shows. So there's an extra one that's not connected with Germans at war, and that is about the British Army anti-locust policy of 1944 and 1945 in Arabia. So if you think I've done some niche subject, there's a really niche subject coming your way on Wednesday, and that's at 12 o'clock midday UK time. And in the evening, Michael J. Stout is coming on, also from the USA, like Jeff today, to talk about the Luftwaffe ground divisions in World War II, so Eastern Front and in the Western Front. So the policy of taking people from the Luftwaffe from kind of the air role and putting them into the combat on the ground, and that'll be really interesting as well. So again, if you're new to the show, don't forget, or to the channel, don't forget to like and subscribe, and the links to Jeff's books are in the description below, and there's more papers and things you can find and editing jobs he's done. But I'm going to bring him back on screen basically to say, well, that was brilliant. I'm not going to say enjoyed it, because dealing with these subjects, it's kind of harrowing, but I enjoyed the process of learning. But some of the statistics are just shocking as usual. So, well, brilliant. You've broken your World War II TV duck. So there we are. Yeah, you've covered everything. People are just saying how great it is. So we will end things there. But I'm going to extend the invitation now. If you'd like to come back on and carry on with this, I know you've looked at the Balkans and stuff as well, or another aspect of this, because I think there's mileage in this economics, operational and ideological, bringing those 3 sides together. So if you'd like to come back, whenever you want, you're welcome.
I very much appreciate it, and I very much appreciate you having me on today.
Well, brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there, folks. So this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV, saying I will see you all on Wednesday. So thank you very much for watching. And again, thank you very much to my guest, Jeff Rutherford. It was absolutely amazing. So cheers, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.